The world has known Brad Pitt as many things: the golden boy of Hollywood, the heartthrob of a generation, the Oscar-winning actor, the scandal-ridden husband. But what the world never expected, what no one was prepared to hear, was that after decades of silence, Brad Pitt would finally confess the truth that lay buried beneath the glitter and gossip. There was one woman who had always been the love of his life. Not Angelina Jolie, whose beauty and intensity set tabloids on fire for over a decade. Not Jennifer Aniston, America's sweetheart, whose breakup with Pitt defined an era of Hollywood heartbreak. No, Pitt's revelation was not about the women the world saw on magazine covers. It was about someone else, someone hidden in the shadows of his journey, someone who defined his silence, his regrets, his secret smiles when the cameras weren't looking. The opening lines of his confession cut like a knife through the carefully curated mythology of Brad Pitt. For decades, Hollywood painted Chaim as a man with it all: wealth, fame, women, children, awards. But in the softest of voices, and with the weight of years pressing on his shoulders, Pitt admitted that the story the world thought it knew had always been incomplete. The greatest role he ever played was pretending that his heart had moved on. This is not just a story of Hollywood romance. This is a story about T-May, about regret, about the cruel way fame can twist and fracture love until only fragments remain. Brad Pitt, the man who seemed untouchable, finally pulled back the curtain and revealed the one truth he could no longer bury: that love is not measured in red carpets or wedding rings, but in the shadows of what we lost and what we never stopped carrying. And so, as the cameras flash one more T-May and the world leans in to listen, the question hangs in the air. Who was she? Who was the woman Brad Pitt calls the love of his life after decades of silence? Before Brad Pitt was the face on 1,000 posters, before the Hollywood premieres and the tabloid wars, he was a boy from Springfield, Missouri. A boy who grew up in the shadow of quiet Midwestern skies, with parents who taught him discipline, faith, and the values of a small-town life. The young Brad was restless, curious, filled with the kind of hunger that only the wide-open plains of America could nurture. He was raised in a family that preached stability. His father, a strict man of business; his mother, the softer, nurturing anchor of the household. But even in that ordered world, Brad felt a pull toward something more. Movies became his escape. Sitting in dark theaters, he learned early that stories could carry emotions deeper than words ever could. He watched faces on the screen break, heal, fall in love, lose everything, and he realized that life, like film, was about the people we let into our hearts. It was in high school, and later at the University of Missouri, that Brad's charm began to surface, a natural magnetism that drew people to Chaim. He dated, he flirted, but beneath the boyish grin, there was always a search for something permanent. Friends would later recall how even in his early 20s, Pitt was obsessed not just with success, but with the idea of a love that could last, a connection that would anchor Chaim when fame and fortune arrived. When he left Missouri for California, he carried little more than ambition in his suitcase. Hollywood was merciless, and Brad Pitt was just another struggling actor, delivering refrigerators, dressing up as a chicken mascot, and waiting tables to survive. Yet, through those years of anonymity, the longing for real intimacy grew stronger. For Brad, love was never meant to be a publicity stunt or a headline. It was supposed to be a refuge. Ironically, it was in those lean years that he would meet someone who planted the first seeds of that unshakable truth. The kind of woman who didn't see Brad Pitt the movie star, but Brad Pitt the dreamer, the vulnerable young man searching for purpose. And while the world was still years away from knowing his name, Brad himself had already begun the silent journey that would haunt his relationships for the rest of his life. The pursuit of a love so deep it could withstand even the firestorm of Hollywood. Hollywood didn't take long to recognize what Springfield had given the world. By the early 1990 seconds, Brad Pitt was no longer just a struggling actor. He was the face of desire. The man whose brief screen T-May in Thelma and Louise ignited an entire generation. The camera adored Chaim, and soon, so did millions of fans. With each new role, Legends of the Fall, Interview with the Vampire, Pitt was no longer climbing, he was soaring. He was sculpted into the image of the perfect man, a sex symbol, a modern Adonis. But with that image came expectation. Hollywood demanded not only performances, but stories, love stories, the kind that sold magazines and filled tabloids. And Brad delivered, or at least, he pretended to. His relationships became public events. Juliette Lewis, Gwyneth Paltrow, Jennifer Aniston. Each romance lit up the headlines, each breakup dissected like a national tragedy. The world thought it was witnessing the intimate truth of his heart, but in reality, Pitt was playing another role. Behind the charm, behind the smiles at red carpets, was a man haunted by the memory of the woman he could never fully climb. A man whose true emotions didn't align with the glossy covers of People magazine. While the world projected onto him the fantasy of a perfect Hollywood couple, Pitt carried the weight of something else. The quiet knowledge that the love of his life was not walking beside him in those moments. The irony of Brad Pitt's rise was cruel. The higher he climbed, the more suffocating the mask became. He was celebrated for his beauty, his talent, his marriages, but the truth remained unspoken. He knew that none of the glamorous romances truly captured his soul. They filled the pages of gossip columns, but they did not fill the emptiness that lingered when the cameras stopped flashing. And yet, the show had to go on. In Hollywood, appearance is survival. Pitt's smile became armor. His romances became scripts written for an audience hungry for fantasy. All the while, the man inside continued to ache for the one story that was never told. This was the paradox of Brad Pitt's rise. The brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadow of the love he had lost. By the early 2000s, Brad Pitt was not just a movie star. He was the movie star. Fight Club had turned Chaim into a cultural icon. Troy made Chaim a living legend, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith sealed his fate as Hollywood's most bankable face. He was at the summit of an industry that worshipped him. To the outside world, it looked like he had everything a man could dream, of money, fame, beauty, influence, and a love life. The tabloids called epic. But for Brad Pitt, the higher he rose, the colder it became. Because at that altitude, when the noise of applause finally dies down, the silence is deafening. And in that silence, he heard the absence of her, the woman he could never hold on to. She wasn't the one walking red carpets with Chaim. She wasn't the one the magazines crowned as Brad's perfect match. She was the ghost in the crowd, the memory that flickered in his mind when the spotlight blinded him. She was the secret truth that made every smile feel borrowed, every embrace feel staged. Hollywood thrives on spectacle, and Brad gave it spectacle. The golden marriage to Jennifer Aniston, followed by the storm of passion and scandal with Angelina Jolie, these were stories tailor-made for the cameras. But the cameras never captured the nights alone. The quiet despair, the way his eyes would drift away, even in the middle of the glamour. Because no matter how many roles he played, no matter how many women the world paired Chaim with, the love that defined Chaim was already gone, slipped away in the chaos of ambition and T-May. Friends would later say that Pitt carried a kind of melancholy that success could never erase. He would laugh, he would charm, but in the unguarded moments, there was a weight in his silence. The weight of knowing that he had once touched something real, and that in chasing the world, he had let it slip through his fingers. At the peak of his fame, Brad Pitt was celebrated as a man who had it all. But in the private chambers of his heart, he knew the cruelest irony of all. that the one thing he truly wanted, love untainted by cameras, pure and untouchable, was the very thing he could never keep. The world saw a star at his brightest. Brad Pitt saw only the vanishing flame of the woman who had once been his true light. Hollywood is a machine that builds legends only to devour them later. And for Brad Pitt, the cracks began to show when the fairy tale marriage with Angelina Jolie, once the most glamorous union on earth, unraveled into one of the most brutal divorces in modern celebrity history. The headlines were merciless: custody battles, accusations, leaked stories of temper, of drinking, of a man unraveling behind the perfect smile. The same magazines that once crowned Chaim as Hollywood's golden prince now painted Chaim as a broken king. The image of Brad Pitt as the untouchable heartthrob collapsed under the weight of human flaws. But the truth was darker than the tabloids could print. Brad himself admitted that alcohol had become his refuge, a shadow that grew stronger as his family fell apart. In interviews, his voice trembled as he spoke of sleepless nights, of guilt, of trying to be a father through the fog of addiction. It was not the Brad Pitt the world wanted to see. It was the Brad Pitt who had finally been stripped of his armor. And in those moments of collapse, the ghosts returned. The woman he had once called the love of his life, the one who slipped away, appeared in his mind more vividly than ever, because when the world burned around Chaim, he realized that fame, fortune, even marriages were fragile. What endured was the memory of that one pure love, untouched by Hollywood's claws. He staggered through the scandals, through the courtrooms, through the loneliness of a man who once had it all. Friends described him as hollow, as if he was walking through smoke. Yet even in the ashes of his downfall, a strange kind of clarity emerged. Pitt confessed in rare moments that he was learning to face he himself, stripped bare, without the masks that had defined him for decades. But the pain was undeniable. Hollywood had seen his triumphs, and now it was feasting on his ruin. And yet, in the ruins, one truth grew sharper than ever, that the greatest tragedy of Brad Pitt's life was not his divorce, nor his scandals, but the love he could never reclaim. The fall was public. The heartbreak was private. And together, they carved scars that even Time could not heal. For decades, Brad Pitt let the world write his love story. The covers of magazines told us who he was supposed to love. The gossip columns told us when he was supposed to fall apart. And the endless speculation painted him as either the villain or the victim. But the one thing he never gave away, the one piece of himself he kept locked in silence, was the truth of his heart. Until now, in an interview that began like so many others, with rehearsed questions and polite answers, Pitt's voice suddenly changed. His eyes dropped, his words slowed, and then, with the weight of years pressing against him, he confessed. He spoke not of Aniston, not of Jolie, but of her. The woman the world never fully saw. The one who loved him before the chaos, before the fame sharpened into a knife. She was not a Hollywood co-star. She was not a tabloid headline. She was, as Pitt described, the one who saw me when I was still trying to see myself. He never gave her name. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear. But the way he spoke made it clear. This was no fantasy, no passing affair. This was the truth he had been running from his entire career. He admitted that every relationship after her was touched by the memory of that loss, that every smile, every wedding vow, every whispered, "I love you," was haunted by the ghost of a woman who had loved Chaim without cameras, without contracts, without judgment. For Brad Pitt, the confession was not just about a lost love, it was about a lost self. The man he once was, the man who could have lived outside Hollywood's madness, had vanished with her. And in admitting this, Pitt revealed what may be his most human truth, that even the world's most celebrated man can live a lifetime aching for what slipped away. There was a pause after his words, a silence heavy enough to remind us that behind the glamour, behind the roles, behind the carefully staged romances, Brad Pitt had been carrying this wound for decades, and now, finally, he was no longer hiding it. The confession did not shock because of who she was. It shocked because it reminded us that even Brad Pitt, the golden god of Hollywood, was just a man broken, longing, and still in love with someone he could never reclaim. Brad Pitt will be remembered as one of Hollywood's greats, the face of an era, the actor who transformed from golden boy to seasoned artist, who conquered the box office and finally won the Academy's respect. His films Fight Club, Seven, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood are etched into cinematic history. His legacy as a performer is secure. But his legacy as a man is something far more fragile, because for all the statues on his shelf, for all the roles that defined him, Pitt's greatest story may not be the one written in celluloid. It may be the story he carried silently, the one he revealed only in fragments, that he had known a love so rare, so consuming, that it haunted every step of his journey, and that Hollywood, with its glare and its hunger, took that love from him, or perhaps he let it slip away in his climb to the top. Fans will forever debate the women in his life. They will dissect his marriages, his scandals, his headlines. But the truth Pitt left us with is more human than the gossip could ever grasp. It is the truth of a man who reached the very peak of human ambition, only to discover that success is a poor substitute for love. And so, his confession leaves us with a question not about his career, not about his fame, but about his soul. Can a man who has lost the great love of his life ever find peace? Can Brad Pitt, after decades of pretending, finally live with honesty, stripped of the mask that Hollywood forced upon him? Or will his name, forever celebrated, forever adored, carry the silent tragedy of a love story the world will never fully know? In the end, the man who played gods and warriors, detectives and drifters, has shown us the most vulnerable role of all, he himself, a man who, after decades of silence, finally whispered the words that revealed everything. She was the love of his life, and the world may never stop wondering who she really was.